In 1940, as Europe burned in the early stages of the Second World War, attention was drawn to blitzkrieg advances in France, the skies above Britain, and the gathering storm in the east. Yet beneath the global headlines, a lesser, known but vitally important battle was beginning to take shape in the Mediterranean Sea, a battle that would define the fate of empires, determine the outcome in North Africa, and directly impact the course of the war itself. The Mediterranean was more than just a stretch of water. It was a strategic lifeline, a maritime crossroads that connected continents, colonies, and critical supply routes. For Britain, the Mediterranean linked the homeland to the Suez Canal, the oil fields of the Middle East, and the vast imperial holdings in India and beyond. If that sea lane were cut, Britain's position in Africa and the Middle East would crumble. Its empire would begin to wither from the edges inward. The Mediterranean was Britain's artery, and its survival depended on keeping it open. To Italy, however, the Mediterranean represented something very different. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, saw it not merely as a strategic waterway, but as a symbol of revived imperial grandeur. He referred to the sea as Mare Nostrum, Latin for our sea, a phrase drawn from the glory days of the Roman Empire. Mussolini envisioned a new Roman domain, one that would dominate the central Mediterranean and restore Italy to its imagined place at the center of global power. He believed that by asserting naval dominance and capturing British and French colonial holdings, Italy could become the third pillar in what he called the Axis Triumvirate, alongside Hitler's Germany and eventually Imperial Japan. On June 10, 1940, with France on the brink of collapse and Britain standing increasingly alone, Mussolini made his move. Italy declared war on Britain and France. Suddenly, the Mediterranean was no longer a shared route among rivals. It became a front line. Italian naval power was significant. At the time, the Italian Regia Marina was one of the largest fleets in the world, boasting 6 modern battleships, over 20 cruisers, dozens of destroyers, and more than 100 submarines. Their bases in Taranto, Naples, and across the Adriatic allowed Italy to project power over the central Mediterranean with considerable reach. In theory, they were positioned to dominate, but the Mediterranean, narrow as it is, also has bottlenecks: Gibraltar to the west, the Suez Canal to the east. And Britain, despite being stretched thin across global fronts, had experience, innovation, and an entrenched presence. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, based in Alexandria and Gibraltar, may have been smaller in number, but it was veteran and battle-hardened. It was also backed by the power of the Royal Air Force, and soon by a bastion of resistance that would become one of the central icons of this entire campaign: the island of Malta. This opening stage of the conflict set the tone for everything that would follow. The Mediterranean would not be dominated by massed fleets clashing head-on in open water, but by a relentless contest of convoys, coastal bombardments, submarine warfare, and air superiority. It was a theater shaped by attrition, strategy, and survival. Italy's ambitions would be tested not just by the might of the British Empire, but by the demands of logistics, coordination, and modern warfare. The stage was set for a prolonged and brutal contest, one that would involve daring raids, unspeakable suffering, and the defiance of small islands and great ships alike. The battle for the Mediterranean had begun. Malta, a small island in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, became one of the most vital and fiercely contested pieces of territory during World War II. Though barely 17 miles long and 9 miles wide, its strategic importance was immense. Sitting directly between Italy and North Africa, Malta offered the British a forward base from which they could attack Axis shipping lanes and protect their own supply routes. It was, quite literally, a dagger thrust into the side of Axis operations in the central Mediterranean. For that reason, both Hitler and Mussolini came to view its destruction as essential, and for Britain, its defense became a symbol of resistance and endurance. The island's importance was both geographic and symbolic. From airfields on Malta, British reconnaissance planes and bombers could track, harass, and destroy Axis convoys en route to North Africa. German and Italian forces, especially the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel, depended on a steady flow of supplies, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and troops. Without them, Axis ambitions in North Africa would collapse. Malta's ability to disrupt these supply lines was so significant that Rommel once said, "Without Malta, the Axis will lose Africa." The island became a thorn in the Axis flank, and it had to be removed. This strategic pressure led to one of the longest and most intense bombing campaigns in history. Starting in 1940 and continuing for more than 2 years, Malta was subjected to a near-constant barrage from the air. The Italian Regia Aeronautica and later the German Luftwaffe targeted airfields, ports, military installations, and civilian areas alike. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Supplies were scarce, food was rationed, and the island's population, both military and civilian, faced hunger, disease, and fear daily. Shelters were dug into ancient limestone, and people spent hours underground, waiting for the bombings to end. The sound of approaching aircraft became a grim routine, and the resilience of the Maltese people became legendary. The British garrison and airmen on the island played a pivotal role in keeping Malta in the fight. RAF pilots flew outdated Hurricanes and later Spitfires to intercept enemy bombers, often launching from makeshift runways and with limited fuel. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns day and night. The Royal Navy and Merchant Navy made desperate attempts to keep the island supplied. These missions, known as convoy operations, became increasingly dangerous as Axis forces intensified their efforts to starve Malta into submission. Perhaps the most dramatic of these efforts was Operation Pedestal in August 1942. A convoy of British merchant ships, escorted by a strong naval force, attempted to break through the Axis blockade and deliver desperately needed supplies. The convoy faced relentless air attacks, submarine ambushes, and mines. Ships were sunk, men were lost, and the sea ran red. But a few vessels got through, most notably the oil tanker SS Ohio, which limped into Valletta's Grand Harbor, half sunk, but carrying the precious fuel that would keep Malta's air defenses alive. The success of Pedestal, though costly, helped turn the tide of the siege. The significance of Malta's survival cannot be overstated. Its continued resistance forced the Axis to divert precious resources and attention away from other fronts. It provided the Allies with a base to project power, gather intelligence, and stage counterattacks. It tied down Axis ships, submarines, and aircraft that could have been used elsewhere. But perhaps more than anything, Malta became a symbol of hope. For Britain and its allies, it represented courage under fire, the refusal to surrender even when surrounded, bombed, and starving. In recognition of this extraordinary resilience, King George VI awarded the entire island of Malta the George Cross in April 1942, the highest civilian decoration for bravery in the British Empire. The medal, awarded to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history, remains a proud symbol on Malta's national flag to this day. In the face of overwhelming odds, Malta had not only survived, it had defied the Axis and helped shape the outcome of the war in the Mediterranean. As the struggle for control of the Mediterranean intensified, the nature of warfare in the region evolved into a deadly combination of naval clashes, aerial assaults, and high-risk convoy operations. Unlike the vast, open sea battles in the Atlantic or Pacific, the Mediterranean's narrow waters, rugged coastlines, and close proximity of enemy bases meant that every movement was exposed to attack from air, land, and sea. This created an environment where strategy, timing, and innovation became the tools of survival. It was in this crucible that both the Allies and the Axis sought to outmaneuver each other through surprise, technology, and sheer willpower. One of the defining moments in the Mediterranean campaign occurred on the night of November 11, 1940. In an operation that would change the future of naval warfare, the British Royal Navy launched a daring aerial assault on the Italian fleet anchored at the port of Taranto. Using antiquated biplanes, ferry swordfish torpedo bombers launched from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, the British executed a night raid that took the Italians completely by surprise. Despite their slow speed and outdated design, the swordfish aircraft proved devastating. In a single night, they managed to cripple 3 Italian battleships, severely altering the balance of naval power in the region. The attack was not just a tactical victory, it was a technological revelation. It marked the first time in history that capital ships had been effectively taken out of action by carrier-launched aircraft in a harbor. The Japanese would later study this raid in preparation for their own infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. The Mediterranean quickly became a proving ground for new forms of warfare. Air superiority played an increasingly critical role. The Axis powers, especially the Luftwaffe, intensified their use of dive bombers and torpedo planes to strike Allied ships and harbors. German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers became a terror over the sea, diving at steep angles with sirens wailing to demoralize their targets before releasing deadly payloads. Allied ships caught without sufficient air cover were sitting ducks, and many convoys were decimated under waves of coordinated attacks. In response, the British increased the presence of aircraft carriers and reinforced key airfields in Egypt, Gibraltar, and Malta, hoping to regain control of the skies. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, another war was being waged. Submarines, both German U-boats and Italian subs, stalked Allied supply routes, sinking merchant ships and warships alike with lethal efficiency. The Germans, recognizing the strategic value of the Mediterranean, sent U-boats through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar to reinforce their Italian allies. These submarines operated from bases in Toulon and La Spezia, targeting British convoys heading toward Malta and North Africa. The British retaliated with their own submarine force, known for aggressive and successful operations against Axis convoys. British submarines such as HMS Upholder and HMS Unbeaten became legendary for their daring attacks, often navigating minefields and evading enemy patrols to deliver crippling blows to Axis shipping. Surface naval battles, while less frequent than in the Atlantic, were equally intense. The Royal Navy, though stretched thin, launched bold operations to intercept Axis convoys and engage enemy warships. Battles like Cape Matapan in March 1941 saw British and Australian warships decisively defeat the Italian fleet, sinking several cruisers and destroyers while suffering minimal losses. The victory at Matapan further cemented Allied naval superiority and demonstrated the effectiveness of radar-guided night engagements. an area where the Royal Navy held a clear technological edge. Convoy operations became the lifeblood of the Mediterranean War. Supplies had to get through whether to Malta, to the British Eighth Army in North Africa, or to various outposts across the region. These convoys faced constant threats from air attack, submarines, and surface raiders. Each convoy that arrived was a triumph of planning, coordination, and courage. The sailors who manned the merchant ships and the destroyers that protected them became the unsung heroes of the Mediterranean campaign. Their work was perilous and thankless, but without it, the entire Allied position in the region would have collapsed. The Mediterranean was not just a stage for battles. It was a relentless contest of endurance and will. For the Allies, holding the sea lanes meant preserving empire, projecting power, and preparing for offensives yet to come. For the Axis, disrupting those lanes was key to keeping their North African armies supplied and their southern flank secure. Every ship sunk, every port bombed, every convoy delayed had consequences that rippled across the desert front and into the very heart of Europe. By the end of 1941, it was clear that the Mediterranean was no longer just a supporting theater. It had become one of the most strategically critical arenas of the entire war. It was a place where innovations in naval aviation, submarine tactics, and convoy defense would shape the future of military conflict. And it was a place where thousands would fight and die, not for territory, but for control of the sea, the air above it, and the supply lines that determined victory or defeat. As the struggle raged across the Mediterranean Sea, its effects rippled deep into the deserts of North Africa. The fate of armies did not rest solely on battlefield tactics or armored strength, but was increasingly tied to one decisive factor: logistics. Every bullet, every tank, every drop of fuel used by the Axis or the Allies in North Africa had to be shipped across the Mediterranean. It was here, between the ports of southern Europe and the arid coasts of Libya and Egypt, that the battle for supply would determine the future of the campaign on land. North Africa's deserts became a reflection of the war at sea. When the convoys succeeded, armies advanced. When they failed, entire offensives collapsed. General Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, was at the center of Germany's effort in North Africa. Charismatic, daring, and aggressive, Rommel had a talent for maneuver warfare and caught Allied forces off guard multiple times during the early stages of the campaign. But Rommel's brilliance was constantly undermined by the logistical vulnerability of his forces. The Africa Corps operated at the far edge of Axis reach. With every advance deeper into Egypt, the distance from supply ports like Tripoli or Benghazi grew, stretching supply lines to the breaking point. Even when supplies reached North Africa, transporting them hundreds of miles through open desert under the constant threat of air attack proved difficult. Trucks broke down, fuel was lost, ammunition ran short. Time and again, Rommel's offensives slowed not because of Allied resistance, but because his tanks literally ran out of fuel in the sand. Behind every failed supply run lay the actions of the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the daring submariners of the Allied forces. From their bases in Malta, Egypt, and Gibraltar, British and Allied forces launched near, constant operations to intercept Axis convoys bound for North Africa. Fast attack boats, bombers, torpedo planes, and submarines turned the sea into a gauntlet. Axis ships were sunk in staggering numbers. Troop transports were lost with all aboard. Fuel tankers burned for days. What made this even more devastating for the Axis was the imbalance. While Britain had long experience in protecting and operating convoys under fire, Italy and Germany struggled to adapt. Their naval coordination was poor, and their air cover inconsistent. The lack of a unified command between Italian and German forces often led to delays, confusion, and missed opportunities that the Allies exploited time and again. The Allies, too, were heavily reliant on convoys. British forces in Egypt, operating under the Middle East Command, required a constant stream of men, fuel, and supplies from the homeland and colonies. Convoys from the Suez Canal or from the west via Gibraltar carried everything from tanks to tea. Malta, with its key location, became both a base of operations and a resupply point, but it too needed to be fed. Operation after operation was launched to deliver the essentials to keep Malta alive, the Eighth Army moving, and the Allied cause alive in the region. One of the clearest examples of this logistical chess game came in 1942 during Rommel's push toward El Alamein. His forces had reached within striking distance of Alexandria and the Suez Canal. Had they succeeded, the result could have changed the entire war in the Middle East. But Rommel's troops were exhausted, undersupplied, and outnumbered. His fuel was dwindling, and Allied air superiority made daytime movement risky. Meanwhile, the British, led by General Bernard Montgomery, had been reinforced, resupplied, and reorganized. Thanks to the safe arrival of convoys and the buildup of material through secure sea routes, Montgomery was ready. The Second Battle of El Alamein marked a dramatic turning point. With superior supply and firepower, the British launched a major offensive, shattering the Afrika Korps and forcing a long retreat westward. This was more than just a battlefield victory. It was a triumph of logistics, made possible by naval and air dominance in the Mediterranean. As Axis forces fled across the deserts, Allied warships and aircraft cut off their resupply, bombed retreating columns, and attacked remaining ports. The sands of Libya became littered with burned-out tanks and abandoned vehicles, silent testimony to the power of supply over strategy. By the end of 1942, the tide was turning. Operation Torch brought American forces into the theater, landing in Algeria and Morocco, and effectively surrounding Axis forces in Tunisia. With both eastern and western flanks collapsing, the Axis position in North Africa became untenable. Cut off from reinforcements, with the sea no longer under their control, Axis troops surrendered en masse in May 1943. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. The North African campaign was over. The victory in North Africa opened the door to the next phase of the war, the invasion of Italy. But it was the war in the Mediterranean, the battle for the sea lanes and the skies above them, that had made it possible. Through relentless pressure, Allied forces had turned a logistical nightmare into a strategic advantage. They had proven that in modern warfare, control of the sea was not a side issue. It was the very foundation upon which victory was built. By the end of 1942, the strategic picture in the Mediterranean had shifted dramatically. The combined efforts of the Royal Navy, the RAF, and newly arrived American forces had broken the Axis grip on North Africa. The desert war that once threatened to reach the Nile had been pushed into full retreat. Rommel's Afrika Korps, once seen as an unstoppable force, was now cornered in Tunisia. With Allied convoys increasingly successful and Malta firmly back in action, the flow of men and materials turned in favor of the Allies. This shift on the ground and at sea signaled a crucial moment. The Allies were no longer simply holding their ground in the Mediterranean. They were preparing to use it as a launching pad for the next phase of the war, The sea that had once been a contested battleground would soon become the highway to Europe's underbelly. The Allied victory at El Alamein followed quickly by Operation Torch. The joint British-American invasion of French North Africa was a masterstroke of coordination and strategy. It marked the first large-scale involvement of American troops on the Western Front of the war, and their impact was immediate. As Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, Axis control in the region began to unravel. German and Italian forces, caught between Montgomery's advancing Eighth Army from the east and the newly landed American and Free French forces from the west, had no path to retreat. Despite fierce resistance and last-ditch efforts to reinforce Tunisia, the Axis supply lines were strangled by Allied naval and air superiority. With every passing week, more Axis convoys were sunk, and fewer supplies reached the front. Starved of ammunition, fuel, and replacements, Axis forces in North Africa were forced to surrender in May 1943, ending the North African campaign and eliminating over 250,000 Axis troops from the war. With North Africa secured, Allied strategists turned their eyes north across the Mediterranean. The next target was the island of Sicily, a heavily fortified stepping stone to mainland Italy. In July 1943, Operation Husky was launched, one of the largest amphibious assaults in history up to that point. It was made possible by Allied control of the Mediterranean Sea. British and American naval forces coordinated to transport entire armies across the sea, protected by air cover from Malta and other recently captured bases. The assault on Sicily proved to be another turning point. Not only did it open the door to the Italian mainland, but it also dealt a psychological blow to the Axis. Within weeks of the invasion, Benito Mussolini was deposed by his own government, and Italy began secret negotiations for surrender. When the guns finally fell silent over the Mediterranean and the smoke cleared from its battle-scarred waters and coasts, a new understanding emerged of just how pivotal this theater had been in the wider context of the Second World War. For years, it had been considered by many as a peripheral conflict, overshadowed by the massive land battles in Eastern Europe, the naval duels of the Atlantic, and the dramatic island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. But the Mediterranean campaign, stretching from 1940 to 1944, was never merely a sideshow. It was a strategically vital front that drained Axis resources, fractured their alliance, tested Allied resolve, and laid the essential groundwork for the invasion and liberation of Europe. The impact of the Mediterranean campaign can be measured not only in strategic gains, but also in lives. Tens of thousands of sailors, airmen, and soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Civilians in Malta, North Africa, Sicily, and southern Italy endured years of bombing, starvation, and occupation. Entire towns were reduced to rubble, and the sea itself became a graveyard of ships and submarines. Underwater, rusting hulls remain today, silent witnesses to the relentless struggle that once raged above. The courage of those who endured it all, whether a British pilot defending Malta, an American soldier landing on Sicilian beaches, or a civilian sheltering beneath crumbling ruins, forms a legacy of quiet heroism. Politically, the Mediterranean War had far-reaching consequences. The fall of Mussolini and the eventual surrender of Italy split the Axis and brought one of its founding members over to the Allied side. German forces were forced to take on the burden of defending Italy alone, stretching their already thin resources and opening yet another front they could ill afford. The bitter campaign up the Italian peninsula that followed diverted significant numbers of German troops and equipment away from the Eastern Front, easing pressure on the Soviet Union and contributing to the overall weakening of Nazi Germany's ability to sustain its military ambitions. The campaign also served as a massive laboratory for modern warfare. The coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, refined over the course of these operations, would be applied with even greater force during the D-Day landings in Normandy. The logistics lessons learned during the long siege of Malta and the North African Desert War taught Allied commanders how to supply large armies over vast distances. Amphibious landings in Sicily and Italy were complex rehearsals for what would come in northern France. Tactical doctrines were tested and refined, new technologies were deployed under fire, and alliances were hardened in the furnace of joint operations. For the Allies, the Mediterranean victory allowed for unimpeded control of one of the most vital waterways in the world. With Gibraltar, Malta, and the Suez Canal in Allied hands, the sea became a secure passageway for troops and supplies moving between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. This freedom of movement had a ripple effect, boosting operations across multiple theaters and reinforcing the global nature of the Allied war effort. What had once been a fiercely contested and deadly sea became a lifeline of victory. The symbolic value of the campaign also carried great weight. The resistance of Malta, in particular, stood out as a shining example of tenacity. The awarding of the George Cross to the island's entire population by King George WWII remains a rare and powerful tribute. Malta's stand embodied the defiance of small nations in the face of overwhelming aggression and showed how strategic will, when matched with sacrifice and courage, could hold back even the most determined enemy. As the war progressed toward its final stages, the Mediterranean faded from the headlines, but its role in reshaping the course of the conflict was undeniable. It had allowed the Allies to move from defense to offense. It had turned Axis victories into attrition and retreat. And it had provided the essential stepping stones, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, leading to the heart of Nazi-controlled Europe. Without the Mediterranean victories, the liberation of France and the eventual march to Berlin would have been far more difficult, perhaps delayed or even denied. Today, the Mediterranean Sea appears calm, its shores lined with resorts and historical landmarks. Yet beneath its surface lie the remnants of war, sunken destroyers, the remains of merchant ships, crashed aircraft, and the scattered wreckage of thousands of lives. These silent relics remind us that this tranquil body of water once hosted one of the fiercest, most complex, and most consequential campaigns of World War II. The battle for the Mediterranean may not be as well remembered as others, but its legacy endures, in strategy, in history, and in the freedom it helped to restore. In remembering this campaign, we remember not only the movements of fleets and armies, but the resilience of people, the importance of unity, and the enduring truth that control of the seas shaped the fate of nations. The Mediterranean was not just a battleground. It was a crucible of victory,